Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. A quick reminder that I do need your support to continue producing and developing this podcast, this rebel transmission. You can become a paid subscriber on Substack, $5 a month. We're doing supporter-only group Zoom calls now, and there's a private chat on the Substack for supporters. You can also buy me a coffee or send reinforcements via donor box. We're joined today by Dr. Jack Rasmus, who's an economist, radio show host, author, professor, Renaissance man. I've been a fan of his work and analysis. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Rasmus.
My pleasure.
And so, as I've mentioned to you, I've known about your work for a number of years. I've recently revisited it. And, just briefly, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your sort of focus and line of work for the Geopolitics and Empire audience.
Well, right now I'm writing a lot about, and have been in the last decade, in several books and countless articles about the U.S. and global economy. That's been a major focus, as well as, what's going on with the U.S. elections here since 2008, financial instability, within the system growing, contradictions in policy growing, and of course, the wars going on, particularly the one in Ukraine, and NATO, and preparations for similar war with China at some date here before 2030. So wars, economy, big political changes and trends going on. That's pretty much my focus. Also, my origins are in the U.S. labor movement decades ago. So I pretty much follow what's happening with the working class and the unions in this country quite a bit. So that's sort of a long-term thread underneath all of my recent interests.
And those are essentially some of my favorite topics that I like to cover on this Getty transmission. And maybe to start, get your thoughts on the state of or the decline of Pax Americana, the American empire. I've been covering that now for a decade. I permanently expatriated from the U.S. 2006. Peace Corps Mongolia was my ticket out. I've had on the podcast twice the late Johan Galtung, who just passed away at age 93, to talk about the fall of the American empire. Cultural historian Morris Berman, who's living down here in Mexico. I've had him on to discuss this. And so, what are your thoughts regarding where we're at regarding the American empire?
Well, I tend to look at it from an economic, financial point of view. And very clearly, the peak of the empire was sometime, before 2008, maybe in those first early years of the 21st century. But since then, the crisis in 2008-9 shows a weakening of the global economy and the U.S. role in it. Never really recovered from 2008, only partially. And then, of course, we had COVID hit, and that was another major crisis, another what I call epic recession, to differentiate from normal recessions and from depressions. The media, Paul Krugman and others, called it a great recession, but I always had issues with them because great is kind of like describing it with adverbs, never really saying how it is different. In my 2010 book, Epic Recession, Prelude to Global Depression, I wrote about how this was fundamentally different. Something new is happening here. The financial cycles are exacerbating the real economy and vice versa, and causing financial instability events. My 2020 book, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, is really about the policies that were introduced by the United States in the late 70s, early 80s in response to the political economic crisis of the 70s, sometimes called neoliberalism, which was really a way of gaining some more time for the empire. And it did. It was successful. The neoliberal policies, starting with Reagan, actually with Carter, and ever since, did buy the U.S. empire some time and actually strengthened the empire in some ways. It dealt with foreign challengers to the empire. Europe, Japan. We used to talk about Japan Inc. back then in the 80s, challenging the U.S. Well, they put that to rest. The U.S. Imperialists put that to rest. They tamed that, and they tamed the social movements of the 70s, and they broke up the big industrial unions and construction unions in the United States. So neoliberalism has always had two main class objectives. One was to deal with their challenges domestically as well as their competitors globally. And it was quite successful in that sense. And then, of course, the Soviet Union imploded, and that challenge, that source was dealt with in the early 90s. And the empire just went on a tear after that. And the neocons took control under late Clinton, a foreign policy, and they've been wrecking it ever since. And domestically, they kind of turned all the deregulation, privatization, turned the big corporations and finance capital loose in the late 90s, early 2000s. So it was the heyday, the first 7 or 8 years here of the 21st century. And, then they had 9/11, which gave them an excuse to really go aggressively into wars. And we've been in wars in the U.S. ever since, ever since 2001. Actually, we were in smaller wars consistently ever since before. But the big war on terror, really boosted the American military and the empire. So the empire was expanding geographically and financially and economically, all during early neoliberalism until it hit the wall in 2008. Also, in around 2008 to 10, we see growing resistance as Russia recovered and China developed. So that was the early challenge, political challenge, economic challenge to the U.S. And they've been trying to deal with that, and slowly, they, meaning U.S. imperialists, slowly in a retreat. And now, of course, the retreat is accelerating with the Ukraine war. Part of the neocon control and the apex of imperial America there was to push NATO east very clearly starting in 1999. That whole began, and basically because Clinton opened the door to them, and that was his way of trying to keep people at bay, trying to impeach him because he couldn't keep his zipper closed. Okay, so ever since then they've been deepening their influence and control, the neocons, with their allies, economic and political allies. Ever since, we've been in wars ever since, and the wars aren't going so good anymore. And we can see that in Ukraine. Clearly, my view on Ukraine is, this was precipitated by NATO and by the U.S. I wrote an article in January 2022, which is on my blog, jackrasmus.com, published a number of blogs, called 10 Reasons Why the U.S. May Want Russia to Invade Ukraine. And I laid out, the objectives and the advantages and goals that the U.S. would achieve by provoking, Putin and the Russians to invade. They wanted them to invade. They had a lot to gain, The big gain, of course, was they drove the Russians out of the Western European economy totally, not just out of the energy sector. They just opened up a big vacuum that American capital stepped right in, not just the energy companies, but all the other companies, that were exiting, particularly the U.S. banks, so forth, just made a big penetration. So one of the big positive outcomes for the empire was it increased its control over Europe. Economically, we're selling natural gas to Europe 4 times the price the Russians were, and that's causing, particularly in the industrial parts of Europe like Germany, some real problems. Companies going bankrupt, deindustrialization of Germany. Now they're all talking about going on. So the U.S. has really captured Western Europe in a significant way as a result of the war, and of course the sanctions have played a big role in that. Europe's been paying the price for the sanctions more than any sector in the global economy. The U.S. now supplies Europe with a lot of its oil and energy. The Middle East does too, to some extent. But some of the Middle East oil and gas is really being bought by countries like Turkey and UAE, and they resell it to Europe. So it's really Russian oil and gas that's still going to Europe, and there are traces of it still going into Europe. But the sanctions have allowed the U.S. to establish tighter hegemony over Europe. And of course, we knew NATO itself was in trouble under Trump, but now the U.S. has solidified its control of NATO using allies in Eastern Europe, particularly. So the Russians, the Germans and the French are kind of like almost sidelined when it comes to running NATO or running a foreign policy. We saw that very clearly with Macron here trying to throw this trial balloon up of, Ukraine's losing. We're going to have to send French troops into NATO, into Ukraine. Well, that one flopped because the rest of NATO did not want to do that, except the crazy Balts. And the U.S. did not want to do that either. The U.S. has come down on Macron and said, shut up.
Yeah.
We don't want to do that in an election year. We got enough trouble. We're trying to put this whole thing on a back burner so Biden can win election again. You're only making it worse. You're crazy. But it shows, the chaos politically in Europe going on among the elites there. They don't know what they're going to do here with Ukraine, because it looks like they're going to get caught holding the bag economically and politically.
Yeah, that's sort of my question on the point of escalation. And, I've had a couple years back, Terry Mason of VoltaireNet on the podcast, and he was saying exactly what you're saying, that the consequences of this war is to deindustrialize Europe. Basically, we're seeing that. Guy Maton, a great Swiss journalist, I had him on as well, who also that was his opinion. And I enjoy your Twitter feed, your X feed, and you commented on the recent terror attack in Russia. And just want to get your thoughts on where you see things going, because I still think that there are crazies in Washington, London, Brussels, that would be happy to escalate and start, a third world war. Gilbert Doctorow, who's a Brussels-based analyst, I've had him on the podcast. And I saw him recently give an interview where he said, he's pointing to Victoria Nuland. It's interesting how she was fired or resigned March 5th. And then you had the U.S. Embassy in Russia give this March 7th alert about a coming attack. And then we saw on March 22nd what happened. And Gilbert Doctorow says the Russians are accusing the U.S. and Britain, and that puts us in a situation as critical as we were in the worst days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what are your thoughts on the recent terror attack, and then whether you think we might move more towards peace talks, as you said, Europe holding the bag, or there's risk of escalation?
Well, I think the latter is more likely here, risk of escalation. It's fascinating that within 55 minutes of the attack, the U.S. comes out and says, "Oh, it's ISIS," as if they knew beforehand, right? Maybe they did know, but they're just trying to make sure that the narrative saves Ukraine, that they're not the focus of the narrative, be involved with this. I kind of think that the security operations in Ukraine are running amok. Kind of deep state, the security surveillance and the special ops, Budanov and Danilov, who got sacked. I think that shows something going on there. My best guess and speculation is that these security services, which, by the way, Nuland was very closely associated with, more so than even Sullivan and some of the other neocons, that they have a whole kind of escalation planned here, not just assassinating Russian journalists or sending drones, but I think this was at least financed somehow by several steps cleansed, removed by these security services in Ukraine. We'll see, soon enough, eventually. The Russians have been very careful not to make accusations until they really have a case. They're intimating that these guys were heading for Ukraine, and they've got records of their conversations, their wireless conversations. What was going on between them and somebody in Ukraine. They don't look very much like ISIS. I mean, ISIS, traditionally they don't surrender without a fight, right? And they don't take payment for money for these things. These are kind of like semi-professionals hired, maybe from Tajikistan here, maybe even trained, or somehow there's a connection between the financing and so forth. And they were turned loose. It's hard not to see a smoking gun here, given all that the Ukrainian special ops has been doing, and this particular event, particularly since it comes on the eve of what's going to obviously be a major Russian offensive now. Very soon in the north, at least around Kharkov, but probably, I would think, in the south around Zaporozhye as well. Some big offensive here, probably within another month. That's probably why the Ukraine tried to attempt some penetration of the border there, the northern border, to find out what they can to disrupt that or whatever. You got to see what happens. It's not by accident that timing's involved here with this Moscow mall here. We got a smoking gun pointed at Ukraine. We don't have the total proof yet, but I think eventually we will. At the same time, you got to remember that a very important statement was made this past week by Putin. Even more important than this mall, I think, and that has to do with the F-16s that are now about to come online here from Europe. It's older version F-16s, but F-16s carry nuclear weapons, unlike the old Russian Soviet arms planes that Europe dumped on Ukraine here initially, right? I mean, this is something new, but the West is saying that they may have to protect the F-16s because they need special runways, and the runways, there's only a couple in Western Ukraine, and they've been being bombed by the Russians. So they're going to protect these assets, but they may run these planes out of Romania and Poland. Well, Putin came out this week and he said, "You run them out of Ukraine and Poland, we're going to attack those airports, those aircraft, even if they're in Romania and Poland." Now that's a big escalation if that happens, and that may be the trump card here for NATO to try to provoke a conflict, a more direct conflict between NATO and Russia, because obviously NATO is running that show. And that's the worrisome thing. I'd watch the F-16s and what they do here, whether they run them out of Romania and Poland or not. Poland may be more reluctant to do that, I think. But Romania, they're just totally, pliable here. Whatever the West wants, they'll do it. You can see that with the different forces being stationed in Romania now, U.S. airborne regiments and the French and so forth. They're there to intervene if the Russians ever get to Odessa, I think. But they'd rather have the Russians do something first as an excuse before they do that, to try to provoke them. I mean, the U.S. is very good at provoking. Given a provocation, they can't resist. The enemy can't resist, and then they got the cover of, we're doing this from a defensive position, not from an offensive. I mean, we've done that in the U.S. Militarily. It's standard procedure. Where you talk about Tonkin Gulf, or you want to talk about incubator babies, or whatever you want to talk about. This is standard ops from U.S. plans to invade. Now, I think pushing against that is. The government, U.S., does not want further escalation of any kind, I think, during election year here. That they don't want to do. Maybe right after, if Biden wins, Trump won't do it. But if Biden wins, that's still up in the air. We're going to see some crazy things happen here before the end of the year in the U.S. elections, I think.
I want to get your further thoughts on that. But just this week, I was listening to one of my favorite Croatian intellectuals who fought in the Yugoslav War, Admiral Davor Domazet Lošo, and he was kind of saying what you're saying. He's saying that the Pentagon wants to take Europe and basically throw it at Russia. We're seeing this trend of conscription, calls for conscription in Croatia, Serbia, I think Germany, all over, Baltic countries. Last week Financial Times reported it's like this trend, like they're preparing for war. And as you say, maybe it's after the elections. But just to go back to the economy for a second, in your analysis, you use terms and others studying empire, like Johan Galtung, always talking about these contradictions. And I think like all these things go together. The decline of the military, we're pulling out of Afghanistan. We fail in Libya. We fail in Syria, Yemen, and so as you mentioned, the financial system is collapsing. We're not doing well militarily, so it's this cycle, this trend, and then the dollar. I think I feel in America the middle class is being eroded. Inflation is insane. Banking crises. There's de-dollarization. Just some of the headlines recently. CNBC yesterday says the wealth of the top 1% hit a record 44.6 trillion. And then Gregory Copley, who I've had on the podcast a number of times with the International Strategic Studies Association, he's come out recently and said, the present decline, distortion, or much heralded end of democracy is overstated, but it is difficult to disagree that the present cycle of democracy, beginning in the 18th century, has run its course. And so your thoughts sort of on the status of the dollar, because if that declines, doesn't that greatly affect Pax Americana?
Well, the dollar is the linchpin of the global empire. If the dollar collapses, then it reverberates throughout the whole empire and the U.S. economy. Obviously, the BRICS are the big challenger right now, and the expansion of the BRICS. Now you got 5 of them, which are in the Middle East. They're adding oil to the whole mix there, the control of oil, and the major manufacturing country of the world, China and Russia and so forth. That's a real threat. And you got to understand that threat and that decline of the dollar was accelerated by the Ukraine war and the sanctions and, seizing of 300 billion of Russian assets, which is just a warning to the global South. You mess with the U.S., we're going to just freeze everything you got. So that's why we see an acceleration of the BRICS as an antipole to the American empire. And I see a bifurcation of the U.S. global empire coming, where the U.S. rallies its closest allies here, circles the wagons, Europe, Japan, Australia, and they try to defend themselves from that stronghold, you might say. And the global South, a good part of it, not all of it, but a good part of it allies itself with the BRICS. And then you got a third element that just tries to play both against the middle, right? So a trifecta of whatever, of what's going on with the global empire. But, it means the decline of the dollar if you get the BRICS starting to trade with an alternative currency or some sort of basket of currencies or solutions, oil is at the basis or whatever instead of the dollar. That's coming. There's going to be the conference in Petersburg here at the end of the year. You got 34 other countries who have petitioned to join the BRICS. Out of that will come, as they say, a new financial structure, global structure. That will be a currency of some kind or basket of currency. That will be a new international payment system instead of the SWIFT that the U.S. uses to enforce its sanctions. That will be has to be some sort of alternative institution to the IMF to maintain currency stability. You've got the Belt and Road, which is already a new World Bank in the making, Shanghai Cooperative Zone, and so forth. This is the real threat to the dollar. And if you got an alternative currency, then you're not going to use the dollar as much for transactions or reserves. That means there's going to be less demand for the dollar. And, economics 101, less demand means the price falls, means the long-term trend for the dollar as it, is not playing the role it plays, it's going to decline in value. If it declines in value, then you're going to have problems with the rest of the world, foreign investors buying U.S. treasuries. Who wants to buy a currency to buy treasuries, because you got to buy dollars first before you buy treasuries, right? Can't buy them with Argentine pesos. Right? If the dollar is falling in value, who wants to grab that dollar to invest? Which means the Fed's going to have to raise interest rates even more to attract foreign buyers and domestic buyers to buy U.S. treasuries. And they've got to buy U.S. treasuries because that's the only way we're funding the deficit. Last year, the Federal Reserve Central Bank spent $2.4 trillion in new issues of bonds, bills, and notes, $2.4 trillion in 1 year to cover the gap that exists between the tax revenues and the spending. Of course, the spending is going crazy because you got war spending going up. You got interest on the debt now, almost $700 billion a year, going much higher, much faster. And those two things are driving the deficit to chronic trillion every year. So if you got tax cuts of $15 trillion since 2001, most of which has gone to the wealthy corporations and the 1%. That's one way they've gotten filthy rich. The corporations get these tax cuts and these subsidies. What do? They just pass it on to their shareholders in stock buybacks and dividend payouts, which is also about 15 trillion, right? So this massive fiscal monetary system I've been writing about, and in my next book, I'm writing about it even more, is become a funnel for income inequality. They're just funneling the money. Fiscal and monetary policy is throwing the money at the corporations, and the corporations are throwing it at their shareholders. It's a big conduit. And of course, wages, real wages and wages in general and benefits are held stagnant or reduced. So you got 125 million households in the U.S. stagnant or going down, and you got the 1% getting rich from financial asset speculation and or from government subsidies, fiscal monetary subsidies going like this. This is the driver for this income inequality that everyone's talking about, but most of the mainstream economists don't explain it. Because if you do, you really come up to the class reality of how this thing works, right, and why it's working. But if you have a problem with the dollar, how is the Fed going to make up that gap, in order to maintain its level of spending on interest payments to the capitalist and or the other defense spending and so forth, which is over $1 trillion now a year, well over $1 trillion. How is it going to make up that gap? Well, it's going to have to sell more than 2.4 trillion bonds. But with the dollar declining, and this is the key, right, it's going to have to raise those interest rates even further to attract foreign buyers to make up for the risk, you see, of the declining dollar. So what I'm describing is how the dollar, in its inevitable decline coming, is going to exacerbate domestic policy and the economy in the U.S. Seriously. It's already serious. The national debt from Congress and real spending is like 34 trillion, and going up. The Fed, what is the Fed total debt? $27 trillion of issuance, 27 trillion in state and local government, another 3-4 trillion, that magnitude of debt in and of itself is not the problem. A lot of people misunderstand that. They think just, this huge debt. If your economy is growing well enough and your tax system is adequate enough, you can finance that debt. But that's not what's happening. The source of financing the debt is not there, so they have to reissue debt upon debt in order to maintain it. The interest rate on the debt is also critical. And for years after 2008, it was zero. So the U.S. was paying zero interest on these bonds that it was pumping into the economy. But since 2023, it's paying 5.5% interest on this thing. And that's why the interest on the debt is ballooning. The interest on the debt is like almost $700 billion this year, and it's going to continue going up. So if you have interest on the debt going up at that rate, that's the real budget, right? And you have a $1.2 trillion in rising defense spending, right? You got $2 trillion of your discretionary spending here, which leaves, barely enough to cover transport and education and all that stuff. So we're heading for real austerity here in the U.S. If they want to, and they have to continue the bond payments and the bond issuance and the interest rates, and they got to keep it up because of inflation. That's another story. If they raise it more, I've always said that 6%, they're going to precipitate a worse regional banking crisis in the U.S. That's why the Fed is frozen at about 5.5%, and it's not going down this year very much because inflation's chronic and high. That I've been writing about why that is so. But the point is they're between a rock and a hard place. The contradictions of fiscal and monetary policy in the U.S. are intensifying, and both of them are exacerbating each other, making the contradictions worse in both. And now you got the dollar coming, the decline of the dollar long term, which is going to intensify those contradictions even worse. That's my general view. My next book coming out, The Twilight of American Imperialism, here by the end of the year, we'll talk about this material basis for the decline of the empire, which I don't think is being addressed well enough, and the financial system underneath it, and the economic and trade relations and so forth. That will be the focus of my book. In other words, deeper than a lot of the analyses at the geopolitical level are talking about it now, because I think that's the key of what's going on. And of course, the wars are accelerating the whole process, as they typically do, including the unplanned wars that Biden has on his hand. He was planning the neocons with Russia. Let's get rid of Russia first, then we'll go after China. But here's the crazy Israelis, upsetting that whole thing and making it even worse. And then the Houthis, Ansarallah, whatever, come into play, and the U.S. Navy's floating around there, on the Horn, and can't seem to get a deal, resolution to it, and they won't. But that's spending who knows what, those task force, all day long.
Just a question on the dollar. I've had on the program people like Peter Schiff, J. Edward Griffin, who wrote The Creature from Jekyll Island, and they talk about this eventual, sort of crack up boom, the dollar hyperinflating. Dmitry Orlov, who's been a recurring guest on the podcast, he talks about this post-Soviet style collapse that America is destined to experience, like what the Russians went through in the 90s. He's saying that would eventually happen in the U.S. Do you see something like that possible?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to say that. That's just sort of projecting, extending, and wishful thinking. Who knows? Who knows exactly how it's going to happen? The collapse of the dollar isn't going to happen tomorrow, right? Or even 2025. This is the beginning of the process. How the process plays out and how fast it goes is unknown. And anyone who tells you they know that it's going to be a collapse total, like 1990s, which was a terrible depression in Russia. That means the collapse of the U.S. and the collapse of its entire empire for good. I don't see that happening. I think it's going to be a slow process here, and the empire is going to fight back. And it has a lot of resources, and it's not collapsing tomorrow, as far as I can see, and I wouldn't want to predict that. But it is clear the momentum is in the other direction. What's been happening since 2008-9 is happening, and probably the periphery of the empire will keep eroding. If Europe gets weaker economically and politically, which I see it in Japan. That's the periphery weakening. You can see it in the economy. As the European economy is much worse than the U.S. economy because it's got no fiscal system. It can't respond the way the U.S. can. And I see that weakening first, before it actually gets to the core, in the USA, Canada, kind of core of the empire. But the empire is clearly going to shrink from its global periphery now with the BRICS. These countries that join the BRICS. It doesn't mean that the BRIC countries won't trade in some way with the U.S., right? But it won't use the dollar as much. That's for sure. And if the empire is smart, it will agree to trade in other currencies rather than the dollar. The dollar was almost 100% back in the early 50s. What is about 60% now? Is a trading and a reserve currency. It's come a long way down and has stayed at that level for quite some time. But it will atrophy even further. But this is a process that's got to work itself out. It's not an imminent collapse. Anyone talks about imminent collapse, I think, is doing a lot of wishful thinking here.
Yeah, and you mentioned periphery, and it's interesting. I've been listening lately to Sergei Iglaziev, economist in Russia, and he just, on his Telegram, and I translated it into English, and he's been saying recently, he said, the core of Pax Americana is falling apart piece by piece. There will not be a one-time general collapse, as happened with the other core of the imperial world economic system, the USSR. Its distant periphery has already fallen away from Pax Americana, so it's exactly as you say. And just to go back for a second to the income inequality that you're talking about, in the past, I've seen you comment on, like these Bilderberg meetings, that you've got the Trilateral Commission, this aristocracy, basically, this 1% class that gets together, Davos, World Economic Forum. And, there's people like Joel Kotkin, who's written a book on Neofeudalism. Like, I feel like they want to bring the Middle Ages back, where there's no middle class and it's just the 1% and then the rest of us. And then we see, I've had on William I. Robinson, who's great. He talks about the global civil war and how they're bringing in these sort of digital technologies for population control. You've got like these digital currencies. I've already been banned from Patreon. The DHS banned me from PayPal. People are getting debanked just for thought crimes. And so do you have any thoughts on, there's this talk of this great reset, right? Klaus Schwab and some of their machinations. Do you have any thoughts about this elite class and, some of their goals?
Yeah, well, who are the elites that you're talking about? Well, I think the core of it are big financial capitalists, right? And then arrayed around them are other powerful capitalists like in energy and so forth. What do they want? They want to continue what they've got, which is, giving them returns like never before in history. We got a financialization of the economy in the U.S. under neoliberalism and a globalization of it, meaning those two words are really imperialism. It's the financial imperialism, but they, mainstream economists they don't want to use imperialism. They don't want to use class, so they say globalization, financialization. What you see very clearly under neoliberalism was a financialization of the global economy. That meant deregulation, not only domestically, but capital flows. Deregulating capital flows globally was a big part of deregulation in the 80s, for example. And that sort of financed the global expansion of U.S. capital, real capital, into the rest of the world, and with that they call globalization, right? So financialization, you've got maybe 250,000 of finance capitalists, maybe more around the world, mostly concentrated in U.S. and Europe, but some in Asia increasingly, who are finance capitalists, meaning what they do is just move their money around globally to speculate and create money from money, right? And that's where a lot of the wealth from financial speculation to the 1% is coming from, whether it's stock markets or bond markets or foreign currency markets or derivatives or whatever. This is this elite around the world that has their institutions, which are the shadow banks, pretty much. Private equity and hedge funds and all these players, right, which are largely deregulated. They're not commercial banks, right? And they have these institutions and these markets they've created for all these assets, and technology allows them to trade instantaneously across them. These are really supranational capitalists here, and they have tremendous influence. Investment banks and hedge funds, insurance companies, and so forth. You can see how they've been placing their key people into the government in the U.S. for decades now, and making sure that the economic policies are advantageous to them, whether it's deregulation or whatever it is. Right? So they have tremendous political influence. I think what they want to maintain is the game that's doing so well for them, and I don't think they have some grand vision of something totally new. that they could create, and this WEF and so forth, I think is overblown. That's kind of where the capitalists get together and talk privately, but as if, that's the only time they talk privately. No, representatives are meeting all the time in all these different bodies and conferences and so forth that you don't hear about. And the WEF is kind of like this high visible thing where they go and play. Right, it's kind of like a global version of Bohemian Grove in the U.S. So I think that's kind of overblown. And to say that they have this grand vision of Bilderberg, and they're getting together and they're planning the whole thing. I think they're just struggling to try to maintain what they got, really, from the challenges that exist. I don't think they have any grand vision here. And of course, the neocons who are in the political side of the elite here are messing things up for them. I think history will show that neocons have done more to destroy the U.S. empire than anything else, than any other challengers. I mean, these people are really imbeciles when it comes to economic consequences and what they're doing. They're responsible for all these defeats, in the wars or lack of victories in the wars. Not all wars end up with victories and defeats. Some of them end up with a kind of truce, and everything is just a mess, and both sides depart. That's kind of like what Afghanistan was, right? It was just a mess. And it's not by accident that in August 2021, Biden immediately, helter-skelter, pulls out of Afghanistan. Why? Because they were already planning to go into Ukraine. They're already setting it up from the spring of 2020. And as soon as Biden got in office, they took that plan that they had before Trump, upset everything. They took it off the shelf and they implemented immediately, and they had to clear the deck of Afghanistan, which was not producing anything, right? And they went right into Ukraine and provoked the Russians. All the policies in 2021 were designed to provoke the Russians, get the Ukrainians talking about nuclear weapons and get them talking about, we're going to join NATO here, 90 days and all that stuff. And then Biden wouldn't even meet and talk with Putin, and the Russians are pleading, let's talk about this. They wanted them to invade,
And speaking of pivoting, that was my next question. You were talking about China earlier. Just these last couple of days, you've got Graham Allison out there in China meeting with the foreign wing, the foreign minister, Xi Jinping. Some have commented, someone's trying to make him the next Henry Kissinger. He's famous for that book on the Thucydides trap, and we're seeing, we're seeing. For me, I'm picking up signals that it's like we're preparing for war again in the Pacific, Taiwan. The Asian NATO, the West is trying to put together. Financial Times reported last week that Japan and U.S. are upgrading their security pact so they can integrate more seamlessly. It's like they're preparing for war. The West is urging South Korea to take on nukes. The Philippines, the Japanese are again upgrading their security pacts. You got AUKUS and all this. And so, do you have any thoughts on what's happening with China and if the West? Because what Graham Allison was talking about, we can either peacefully, come together, or there's the other option of just full on war. What are your thoughts on China?
I think they're definitely planning for a war, but not before 2030. I think it's a long-term plan because it's going to take a while to get their ducks in order. They're, as you said, they're trying to get Japan and South Korea to rearm, particularly Japan. And they're throwing all kind of weapons into Taiwan. They got a nuclear sub production deal with Australia. And I just heard that they got a deal with Australia to produce long-range missiles, ATACMS, they call them, ATACMS, and HIMARS and so forth, 3,000 systems a year, Australia, right, to produce them. These aren't signs of peace. Whether they play that military card or use it just to try to intimidate China, which they won't do. I think that's what's going on over there in Asia. Now, you got to understand that the U.S. Went to economic war with China in 2017. That's when the U.S. trade agency came out with a report saying that China was a military threat because China was challenging the U.S. in Area 3 technologies, which were critical for future war. What were they? They were AI, cybersecurity, and I think the third one was maybe cloud computing. I don't know. One of those three, but AI was part of it. And you got to understand that the Trump trade war with China that began in the spring of 2018 was really about demands the U.S. Had with China to put its AI and tech development on the shelf. That's what they wanted. Now it got embroiled with U.S. banks wanting 51%, and ownership of their banks in China and U.S. Agricultural exports. It all got mixed up, and there were different interest groups behind the U.S. But it turned out to be a total failure. The U.S. did not achieve what it wanted in terms of slowing down China's tech development. It slowed down its exports of food to China. China went and found food somewhere else, not just in the U.S. But the banks got what they wanted, which was the 51%. China gave it to them because they'd already given it to Europeans, So it was a failure under Trump. Now, what you got to see with Biden is they're not doing the trade weapon going after China. It's just straight embargoes and getting companies not to deal with China in Europe and U.S. Huawei was the first one, but it's across the board now. It's happening everywhere. The U.S. is trying to squeeze China and its alternative tech development because AI is the key to future warfare. AI adapted to military technologies, and both sides know it. And there's only two players in the world at AI and next-gen technology. I mean, look at the patents being filed. Only two countries own now over 90% of the patents, China and the U.S. Europe isn't even in the game. Europe is so far behind. Another reason why Europe is done economically, plus the U.S., of course, is sucking out capital out of Europe, and it's throwing in high-priced resources into Europe. Europe is kind of economic satrapy in the United States, no doubt about it. And it's going to be run from NATO unless NATO busts, with Trump coming in. And the Europeans know it. That's why they're running helter-skelter, trying to, how are we going to get our own defense industry? The Americans are pulling out. They see the writing on the wall, and they're trying desperately, but they don't have the economy to produce it. And if they put, new investment into military production, then that's the end of their social safety net, right? Then they're going to look more like the United States in terms of no safety net, right? And I don't think the European people who are used to that for generations now are going to put up with it. There's going to be a lot of unrest in Europe.
A lot more yellow vests and stuff like that. And you mentioned 2030, and I've had a number of guests over the past years echo your same sentiment that the chances for war increase from 2025 to 2030. As you said, they're biding time. If we jump ahead 5 years and things don't go smoothly, I mean, how would you envision? Have you ever done that thought experiment of what effectively this third world war would look like? Would it look like the Terminator movies where Skynet has become self-aware and it's just Chinese autonomous drone swarms? And these laser, we've been seeing now that, them rolling out these laser weapon devices. Any thoughts on what a potential war might look like?
Well, you can see its early indications in Ukraine. I mean, the days, and NATO unfortunately still thinks this way, the days of great armored formations rolling across plains, whether it's in Europe or in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or whatever, those days are gone. That never will happen again because of the technological changes. I mean, future war is drones, of course, being more and more sophisticated, and AI drones. Right now you need a controller back in a headquarters somewhere, looking at his screen and seeing the battlefield and directing the drones and so forth. But self-directed drones, massive numbers of them, very powerful. Armored columns. Tanks. There's no protection in tanks. There's no protection in trenches anymore, right? And long-term missiles, hypersonic missiles that you can't defend against, right? The radar can't pick them up. They're too maneuverable and they're too fast, and you don't have hypersonic anti-missiles. That's what future war is going to look like, whether you send in troops after, which you have to, is after the destruction. I don't see war being anything. Another thing is these navies, these sitting ducks. These ships, surface ships, are sitting ducks. That's as outmoded as the battleship was with the aircraft carrier, even more so. Right? They're just, as we see them even in the Black Sea. I mean, it's easy. They move too damn slow. Right, and they're too easy to target. And the same with tanks on the ground. Abrams tanks, whatever, they move too damn slow for the maneuverability and the firepower and the massing of weaponry at a cheap cost, in the form of drones and missiles. That's the future in warfare, as I see it. Submarines may be different, but surface fleets are yesterday. They don't have a chance, which makes the U.S. very vulnerable. If you get to an all-out war, of course, I mean, if you send missiles to destroy a U.S. aircraft carrier, you're in World War III, no doubt about it. Right?
Yeah, there was an astonishing example. I don't know if you saw the clip a week ago in Israel or Palestine, where I guess 4 Palestinian youth were just walking, and it's speechless to watch this. They just vanished. Right, in a cloud of smoke, completely blown apart by these drones. And Edward Snowden chimed in and said, it's algorithmic sort of. Someone clicks a button and you're literally blown to smithereens, and that's kind of like maybe a shape of things to come. And to come back to the home front, USA. I know you said that's something you're focusing on as well. I'm worrying about that. Although I'm here on the outskirts of empire, so I feel a little safer. But we've got the elections. There's this potential for chaos. The Civil War movie is coming out next month. There's talk of like second Civil War, and then we've got these rogue intelligence agencies, like I've said, the Department of Homeland Security, Deutschland Security, basically debanking people like me. There was a clip yesterday, FBI visiting someone in the U.S. for comments they made on social media. I mean, it's absolutely insane. And so any thoughts on the 2024, 2025, the elections and chaos that you might envision?
Well, I see more intense attacks of free speech on social media. That's coming, no doubt about it. And in many ways, shapes and forms, financial and personal and all kinds of ways. But this is a part of the development of propaganda and the media as a vehicle of propaganda. I remember in Vietnam days, we had some independent media, and big factor in ending that war was the reporting with visuals of U.S. Soldiers here dead laying on tanks, right? And they were bringing them back, right? You didn't see that beginning with the Gulf Wars, first of all, right? And ever since 9/11, the propaganda machine and the control of people through information on databases and so forth and means is really intensified. Is particularly here with Ukraine, as bad as the 2003 propaganda in the mainstream media was. I mean, the propaganda machine here, with the Ukraine war is even magnitudes tighter. And it's getting tighter. It's not only the mainstream media, but preventing people from getting access to other media. We've got a little respite here on X because of Elon Musk, but they'll get him. Not him personally, he's too important, but they'll find ways, particularly if the conflict intensifies, find ways of coming down on guys like you and me and finding ways of discouraging us, to put it put it politely, and tighten up the whole apparatus so people really don't know what's going on. I kind of wrote about this in my Scourge of Neoliberalism book, saying that neoliberalism as an economic policy regime cannot continue without restricting further democracy. Democracy is an obstacle to neoliberalism and the wealth that it produces for the 1%. So they're going to circumscribe it more and more, which is what they've been doing, of course, whether it's civil liberties, whether it's, free speech, whatever. They're just tightening the noose, and they're going to continue to tighten the noose. And what little electoral democracy we have, which is not the same as democracy, is more than just elections, but even the elections, are being tightened up here in terms of control from the top down. So democracy is a casualty of neoliberalism, and neoliberalism, as I said, is getting more desperate to maintain itself, especially as the empire collapses. Will this result in civil war? I don't know. I think that's right now that's a lot of alarmist QAnon stuff, originated QAnon stuff. I don't see any kind of organized civil war, right? And these spontaneous eruptions that we've seen from time to time, whether it's what was it, 2011? If you go, Occupy Wall Street, or whether in Egypt, or Yellow Vests, or even January 6th. These events are just spontaneous insurrections, partial insurrections, and the elites have found ways of just waiting them out. They just stonewall them, and when they peter out, because there's no organization to them, you see. They talk about January 6th as a revolution. There was no revolution. There was a riot at best. There were no political objectives there. No one thought about, okay, after we trash a few offices in the Capitol, what next? These people were so dumb and so naive, and now they got them all in jail mostly, right? So that doesn't work. That doesn't work. Insurrections don't work. Quote, spontaneous eruptions, jacqueries or whatever they called in the Middle Ages, the peasant rebellions, these things just peter out. And the capitalists and elite know how to deal with them. Until you see some really organized political structures and organizations, parties, whatever, because they've captured all the parties and integrated them all. Social democracy that used to be some opposition has been totally co-opted and integrated within the mainstream capitalist political parties and organizations. It doesn't exist in Europe anymore. And what little semblance there was in the Democratic Party disappeared decades ago. Okay. So I see no way of a civil war, except a lot of talk about that. And, that can be dealt with very easily by the capitalists, and they've shown they're capable of doing it. You just pick people off, throw them in jail or worse.
Yeah, the apparatus has gotten pretty big. Then thoughts on the way forward, what people can do. I talked to Ron Paul on the podcast last year, and he says, we have to keep pamphleteering, speaking the truth. He's optimistic that in the end, whenever that is, we will succeed. But any thoughts on what we can do, the way forward? Any thoughts on, and I totally agree with you. We have like a uniparty. There's RFK Jr. But any other thoughts on the way forward?
Yeah, well, I've always said that the only number one question is the organization question. What do I mean by that? I mean that until you have a truly independent of the political parties, truly independent, and RFK isn't, right? Until you have that true independence where they aren't controlled by money from the wealthy or clever opportunists, right? But by real people leading real movements from below who can get together and have regional and then a national convention and form their own political party and their own structure with protections against how they remain independent, because the pressure will be be great as they grow in success to co-opt them and integrate them. Until that happens, nothing's going to happen, because you have to have a movement and a political party that actually competes for the institutions of power. To some extent through the electoral system, even given its limitations, without being too naive about that's not the whole solution, right? Until you have that, you don't have anything. You have yellow vests and Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter, and they all dissipate. They get tired, they dissipate, or the best leaders are bought off or are knocked off, one or the other. That's the way that the strategy goes. But you got to have people who are leaders of real movements, even small movements, coming together and deciding, to form an umbrella organization. In other words, they're no longer going to be big fish in a little pond. They're going to be smaller fish together in a bigger lake, right? They got to come to that conclusion. And right now, most of them haven't come to that conclusion because they like it where they are, right? Particularly in the U.S. Keep it fragmented. Keep your opposition fragmented, whether you're dealing with countries or whether you're dealing with domestic movements, right? That's a strategy, and it works quite well and has been in the U.S. But until that's broken, that organization question is solved, whatever that is. I have no crystal ball. There's no movement forward, right? There's just continual pushing us back and fragmenting us and taking advantage of us and throwing just enough crumbs at us to keep us from erupting, right? And that's what the strategy is, just to throw enough crumbs to keep it from erupting. But I've said that the challenge to capitalism is threefold here by the mid-century. Very clear. There's three things that I don't think they're going to be able to resolve here, and their grip is going to really decline by mid-century. One of them is the climate crisis. I don't see them getting a handle on the climate crisis using the market system to be able to do that. And because of the pressures to spend on the public system, that's not going to be sufficient either, right? So that's going to get out of control, and then people are going to really feel things directly, and they're going to respond, demand solutions of it. The other thing is AI. AI is going to destroy millions and millions of jobs, hundreds of millions of jobs, simple decision-making jobs, in services, not just robots in manufacturing, but in services are going away already. I mean, that train has left the station big time, and already we're seeing the loss of those simple decision-making jobs as a result of this latest stage of AI, generative GPT, generative AI. But when you get to a general AI, artificial general AGI, the software will be even more intelligent and will be able to eliminate even more jobs, right? And, even Goldman Sachs a couple of years ago predicted 300 million jobs will be lost or undermined in a world. That I think is an early forecast. I think there's going to be even more. And it's the simple jobs, simple decision-making jobs, and then increasingly more complex jobs that are going to be eliminated. And the capitalists love it because it means productivity and profitability. It means squeezing real wages even more for everybody, except those that are critical for advancing AI. They're going to get paid very well, and they still are. If you're an AI engineer or whatever, you're starting at 200,000 up right now, right? They'll pay that small number of people a lot of money to help them make the profits and implement all of this. But those at the bottom, customer service reps and all the rest of them, their retail people, et cetera, they're gone. They're gone. So how is the system going to maintain all that unemployment is the question, right? How are they going to do that? Universal basic income? No, they don't want to do that, not in the U.S. anyway. I don't see how they're going to resolve that. I mean, the loss is going to be so quick in employment and income so fast. And by the way, that'll exacerbate income inequality, because you see inequality is really for the mass of people, keeping the wages down or lowering them while you use financial speculation and government subsidies and tax cuts and new technologies drive the shareholders go up. It's two directions. Income inequality has two directional forces, and this is working quite well. And this is going up and up and up. Through COVID, what billionaires were formed through COVID, while the rest of the people suffered. Right. So AI is the second one. Climate problems they can't get their hand around. AI they won't be able to get their hand around. And the third one is I don't see the empire going away quietly. I think at some point they're going as they get put in a corner and they get panicked. The wolf gets cornered, right? The wolf is going to snap out, and they're going to make a big mistake somewhere along the road leading to World War III or use of nuclear weapons or something. I don't see them going. The American empire is not going away quietly. It's not just going to fade. It's not going to be like Russia in the 90s where people just collapsed, and there was Yeltsin sort of just controlling everybody as the whole thing, the floor collapsed, right? Yeltsin's only move of any kind was finally figured this out, and he puts Putin in charge, and Putin slips by everybody as the empire gets blinded by the terrorist war, and China sort of slips up faster than they thought it would and developed, once it was given PNTR, preferred nation trading rights in the U.S. So those three things, I think are the real dangers to capitalist control by mid-century. I don't see they're going to get a handle on that.
Yeah, that last point, that's how I felt for the longest time now. I don't see Washington going out quietly. And that's, as you say, I mean, this process is going to take many years, decades, but they're nuts. Like the things that in the 50s, they've talked about, using nukes in the Korean War, the Joint Chiefs with JFK, Operation Northwoods, and wanting again to do crazy things in the 60s, which JFK stopped. And it's just like, we've got these crazies who are being held back by various forces each time. But as you mentioned, it's just one mistake. And just to go back real quick, just to get your quick thought on RFK Jr., I feel like he started out well speaking against the system. I felt like he was the most outspoken, political figure that I've seen in the longest time, speaking so brazenly about the deep state, the big pharma military industrial complex, them whacking his father and his uncle and MLK Jr. But it just seems like he's been eaten now by the system. And any thought on RFK Jr. where he is at the moment?
Yeah, well, where he is that he's a total supporter of the genocide in Israel. Why is that? Well, he's smart enough to know how the system works that you don't alienate that money base in the U.S. if you want to get into the mainstream. So he's, whether he believes it or not, tactically he is in that camp. Which is one reason alone not to support him, I believe. But then he points his vice president here, the big money bag, tech wife of Sergey Brin, which means he's got money, and he hasn't alienated the money, the pro-Zionist money in the U.S. to oppose him, and he's gotten the tech money. Both of those are money from the Democrat Party base. Right. I think he's the big spoiler. He's going to almost ensure, if he gets on the ballot, on enough ballots, he will ensure that, Biden loses here, who's already running behind. But then again, there's only, with the electoral system, there's only 7 states that matter for a long time now. That's Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. I forget what the 7th one is. But it's the electoral votes in those 7 states in the last 3 elections that have made the difference, and that's that archaic electoral system that neither of these parties want to get rid of. By the way, we don't have a 2-party system. We got a 1-party system with 2 wings. You see, 2 wings. One's called Democrat and Republican, and the elites are in a food fight with each other. over this, but on certain things, they're in total agreement. The total agreement on the empire and maintaining the empire, total agreement on Israel, total agreement on a whole number of things, taxes and so forth, right? And they're really fooling the people, right? And the people think there's an alternative in the change, and there's not. It just keeps going on, as we've seen. And the issues in politics are no different today than they were in 2016, are they? They're the same issues, same people. In midterm elections, nothing changed. It was the same issues, same people. So they got a lock on the system, the way it is here in the last decade. And I don't see that changing. And RFK isn't going to change it, but he could spoil it. And the question is, why is he doing this? I'm sure, does he really think he'd get elected, given the system? Can he win those 7 states? By the way, in all of them, Biden's behind, and he's really behind in the southern tier of Arizona, Nevada, Georgia. He's got no chance in those states. How could he win, if he can't win all 3 of those that we saw last election, or at least 2 out of the 3? And now he's in big trouble there in Michigan as well. I think he's political toast. I don't think he has a chance to win. And the question is, how are they going to let Trump take office? Is he going to let him run, for example? They tried with this ballot stuff to throw him off. That didn't work because he's got a Trump Supreme Court, right? What else could they do? Would they do to get him off the ballot? I think they're played out. They can't get him off the ballot, I think. But what could they do between November and next January is the question. Playing games with the and they will risk undermining the legitimacy of the electoral system to maintain power. I think it doesn't matter. It could be so brazen what happens to prevent him, because they got a lot of money and power to be lost, in NATO and everywhere else. They don't want to do this. He already upset their plans in 2016. They say if he upsets it for another 4 years, they may never be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, which the main plan was to neutralize Russia before they go after China. That was the plan. That was laid out in RAND reports in 2015. That was the plan, right? And he sort of stopped that. It was put on the shelf until Biden dusted it off in 2021 and implemented it again, right? For him to interrupt it 4 more years, I think it's just chaos for them, for the elite, for the neoliberal elite, right? It's chaos for them. So I see them doing something really dramatic, regardless of the cost, between November and January of next year.
Well, it's not gonna be dull. It's gonna be fascinating times, and as I like to say lately, I'm trying to give people here master classes, and so this was covering the waterfront, a master class for everyone from Dr. Jack Rasmus. And if you've got any final thought for us, and then if you want to tell us again projects, your books, best websites, your links will be in the description, but if you just want to let us know. Well,
as I mentioned briefly, my next forthcoming book with Clarity Press is Twilight American Imperialism, sort of summarizing the whole imperial effort of the U.S., starting from the 18th century and all the land grabbing here from Native Americans and Mexicans and British and all the rest, Spanish, etc. That land grabbing imperialism and how it transformed into a global imperialism with the Spanish-American War in World War I and II and so forth, and then the crisis of the imperial structure going on now that we talked about in some general length here. That's my immediate project. I also have a play called 1934, which is a musical about the 1934 San Francisco waterfront during the general strike there, that I'm beginning to peddle around. So if anybody knows labor theaters or whatever are interested, do let me know here. That's another one of my projects. And the other is to write, I'm halfway through a memoir here of, my own experiences starting as a working class youth here in the post-war period and seeing the empire expand and then decline, right? That whole memoir, that whole period, kind of a long period for memoir, but my early times for a dozen or more years in the labor movement at the ground level as an organizer, and then in the tech sector for 20 years, as a researcher and analyst, and then coming to academia late and writing these 8 or 9 books that I have. So that's a memoir that's really about not just my life, but about the country itself and how it's changed so dramatically from the beginning days of imperial expansion to the current days of imperial decline. Those are my 3 main projects. I write a lot, as you know, day to day on events on Twitter. My handle is Dr. Jack Rasmus there on Twitter. Some of the longer articles I write on inflation and so forth, the economy, on my blog, jackrasmus.com. And where a lot of my interviews like this are posted as well as my radio show, which is sort of like a weekly summary of things that are going on, which is Alternative Visions on the Progressive Radio Network. So that's where you can find whatever I have to say on what's going on.
And the thrust of your upcoming book reminds me a bit of a book, Our Country, I forget the full name, by Richard C. Cook, who I interviewed on my TNT radio show not long ago. And so the links are in the description. So everyone be sure to follow Dr. Jack Rasmus. And thank you again for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
My pleasure, anytime.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.